The wind howled across the wide, open land like a restless spirit. Snowflakes twisted and spun in the air, carried by the cold breath of the northern winter. Thomas Hale leaned forward in his saddle, his scarf pulled up to cover most of his face. His horse, a strong chestnut gelding named Rusty, moved carefully along the icy trail, each step crunching on the frozen ground. The trees around him were coated in white, their branches heavy with snow. Thomas was used to silence. Out here on the frontier, miles away from the nearest town, silence was his only neighbor. It didn't scare him anymore. It had been 3 years since the war ended, and he came back home to find no family waiting. Life had taken too much from him. Since then, he had lived on his ranch with just Rusty, a couple of cows, and the sound of the wind. This morning was colder than most. The sun hadn't yet broken the horizon, and the pale light of dawn made everything look ghostly and still. He had left early to check the fence line on the north ridge before the next snowstorm hit. If a post was broken, the cattle could wander, and finding them in this weather would be close to impossible. Thomas rode with his shoulders tight, breathing through the wool scarf. But then something made him stop. At first, he thought it was just a shadow under the trees, but as he looked closer, something about it didn't feel right. It wasn't the shape of a fallen branch or a bush. It was uneven, soft around the edges, and it seemed to tremble just a little. He narrowed his eyes, lifted a hand to block the wind, and looked again. Rusty gave a soft snort, picking up the scent of something unfamiliar. Thomas gently patted his neck. "Easy, boy," he whispered through the scarf. The shape was about 30 yards off the trail, near a cluster of pines. Snow had covered most of it, but part of it moved. Thomas felt a weight settle in his chest. No one should be out here in this cold, not unless something had gone very wrong. He turned Rusty off the trail, guiding him carefully through the powdery snow. His boots brushed against low branches and snow fell onto his shoulders as they got closer. The shape slowly came into focus. It wasn't a shape. It was two people. Two young women were huddled together at the base of a pine tree. Their skin was pale from the cold, their hair tangled with snow. One had her arm wrapped around the other as if shielding her from the wind. Their thin clothes were soaked through, no match for the freezing night. Their eyes were half closed, their lips pale and cracked. Thomas's heart clenched as he knelt down beside them. "Hey," he said softly, brushing snow off their faces. They didn't answer. One of them shivered weakly, a sound like a whisper slipping from her throat. Thomas quickly checked their hands. Their fingers were stiff with cold, but there was still life in them. They were freezing, but they weren't gone yet. He didn't know who they were at first, but the beadwork on their clothing told him they were Apache. He had seen their people passing through these lands before, moving quietly like the wind. The winters had been cruel to everyone this year, and it wasn't strange to find someone lost in a storm. But finding two young women alone out here, that meant something bad had happened. Thomas looked around. No camp, no horses, no tracks except faint ones already being erased by fresh snow. They must have been out here all night. The older sister, though weak, opened her eyes for a brief moment. They were dark and sharp even in her pain. She tried to speak, but the sound came out as a soft gasp. The younger one's breathing was shallow, her body almost limp. Thomas didn't think twice. He pulled off the thick wool blanket tied to the back of his saddle and wrapped it around both sisters as tightly as he could. His gloves shook slightly as he fastened the blanket to keep out the wind. Their bodies were icy cold, and he knew if he didn't get them to warmth fast, they wouldn't survive another hour. "All right, hold on," he muttered under his breath, more to himself than to them. He lifted the younger sister first, cradling her carefully. She was light, far too light for someone her age. Her head fell against his shoulder as he carried her to Rusty. He set her gently in front of the saddle, then returned for the older one. She tried to stand, but her knees gave out. Thomas caught her before she hit the snow. Her hand clutched at his coat as if she was scared to let go. "You're all right," he told her. "I got you." He helped her onto Rusty behind the younger one, then climbed up himself. He wrapped the remaining end of the blanket around all three of them and clicked his tongue for Rusty to move. The horse, steady and sure-footed, turned back toward the trail. The wind hit Thomas's face like sharp knives, but he ignored it. He could feel the weight of the sisters leaning against him. The older one was breathing fast, like someone who had fought hard to keep going. The younger one barely made a sound. The trail home seemed longer than usual. The storm clouds were thickening and the snow was falling faster. Thomas urged Rusty to keep moving, his jaw clenched. He couldn't lose them. Not after finding them like that. When the cabin finally came into view through the trees, it looked like a small island of hope in a sea of white. Smoke curled weakly from the chimney. He had left the fire burning low before he left. He rode straight to the front, jumped down, and carried the sisters inside one by one. Warm air hit their faces as soon as the door closed. The cabin wasn't fancy, but it was sturdy and warm. The wooden walls kept the wind out. The fire flickered in the stone hearth, filling the small room with light. Thomas laid them down on the rug near the fire and piled more logs onto the flames. The heat grew quickly, chasing away the biting cold that had clung to their skin. He found a dry blanket and wrapped it around them. Their teeth chattered, their lips trembling, but they were alive. He knelt beside them, rubbing their hands gently to bring the feeling back. "You're safe," he whispered. He didn't know if they understood the words, but the tone mattered more. The older sister's eyes flicked open again. She looked at him for a long moment, her expression caught somewhere between fear and disbelief. She seemed like someone who had seen too much and trusted too little. Thomas understood that feeling. He didn't press her to speak. He just stayed close to the fire, making sure it didn't go out. Outside, the storm began to build, snow blowing against the cabin walls. The world out there was merciless, but inside this little room there was warmth. There was breath. There was a chance. Thomas sat back on his heels, looking at the two girls sleeping beside the fire. He had lived alone for years, never expecting anything to change. But tonight something had changed. He didn't know why the two sisters had been out there. He didn't know what story they carried with them. But he knew this much. He was not going to let them die in the snow. As the fire crackled softly, the sound filled the room, wrapping them in a fragile sense of peace. Thomas leaned back against the wall, exhaustion pulling at his eyes, but he didn't sleep. He watched over them as if they were family already. He didn't plan it that way, but life on the frontier didn't follow plans. It followed moments like this where a choice to help could change everything. And as the snow piled up outside, the storm that had nearly taken their lives only made the fire burn brighter inside the cabin. The storm outside the cabin grew louder as the day passed. The wind banged against the wooden walls as if it wanted to come inside. Snow piled higher against the door, and the world outside disappeared under a thick white sheet. Inside, the small cabin was warm. The fire burned strong, casting a soft golden light across the floor, and the two sisters wrapped in blankets near the hearth. Thomas Hale moved quietly, adding more logs to the fire, stirring a pot of broth he had made from the last of his winter stores. He glanced at the sisters every few minutes. The older one stirred first. Her dark eyes blinked slowly as she looked around the room, confused at first, then alert. Her hand instinctively reached for her sister, and when she felt the younger girl breathing, a wave of relief crossed her tired face. Thomas didn't speak right away. He knew what it was like to wake up in a strange place. He simply knelt by the fire, holding out a small cup of warm broth. Steam rose into the air. "Here," he said gently, his voice low and calm. She looked at the cup, then at him. For a moment her body stiffened, unsure whether to trust him. But then her gaze moved to her sister again, still asleep, cheeks flushed now instead of pale. Slowly she accepted the cup with trembling hands. She brought it to her lips carefully and sipped. A faint sound escaped her throat. Not words, just a sound that spoke of relief and pain at the same time. "Good," Thomas murmured. "Warm up." He returned to the fire and stirred the pot again. The older sister took small sips, her eyes never fully leaving him. She seemed to study every move he made, as if trying to decide what kind of man he was. It took another hour before the younger sister woke. Her lashes fluttered like a bird testing its wings. She shivered and let out a weak sound. The older sister leaned over her, whispering something in Apache. Thomas didn't understand the words, but he understood the feeling. It was the voice of someone trying to bring hope. He walked over with another cup of broth and handed it to the older sister, who helped the younger one drink. Color returned slowly to the younger girl's cheeks, and the fog in her eyes began to clear. Thomas leaned against the table, arms folded. He was used to quiet days, but today felt different. It wasn't just the storm or the cold. It was the presence of two souls who had survived something harsh. He didn't know their story yet, but it was written all over their faces. Hunger, exhaustion, and the weight of things left unsaid. Name? He asked gently, tapping his chest. Thomas. The older sister frowned for a second, then slowly touched her chest. Ayanna, she said. He nodded. Ayanna. Then he pointed to the younger sister. Ayanna touched the younger girl's hand softly. Nayeli, she whispered. Nayeli, Thomas repeated carefully. The younger girl gave a tiny smile, almost shy, like she wasn't used to hearing strangers say her name. Thomas didn't ask more. He didn't need to. Sometimes names were enough to build the first small bridge. The day slowly moved forward, hour by hour. Outside, the snow kept falling, covering the world in silence. Inside, the warmth slowly seeped back into their bones. Ayanna helped Nayeli sit up, wrapping the blanket tighter around her shoulders. Thomas made more broth, some cornbread, and shared it with them. They ate slowly, still weak, but grateful. Later in the afternoon, Thomas went outside to check on Rusty. The snow was up to his knees, and the wind was cold enough to sting his skin. He brushed the snow off the horse and gave him some hay. The horse shook his head and snorted, warm breath fogging the air. When Thomas returned to the cabin, Ayanna was sitting up straighter now, watching the flames. Nayeli lay curled under the blanket, her eyes half open, still tired. Ayanna's hands were outstretched toward the fire, and she turned when she heard the door creak. Thomas stamped the snow from his boots and set down his gloves. He noticed the way Ayanna's eyes followed his movements, not in fear anymore, but with quiet alertness. She was strong, even after nearly freezing to death. Storm's bad, he said, though he knew she didn't understand all his words. He pointed toward the window where the snow whipped against the glass. Snow. Then he made a gesture of blowing wind. Ayanna nodded slowly. Cold, she said, her accent heavy but clear enough. Thomas gave a small smile. Cold, he repeated. He went to the fire and sat down on the floor near them, not too close, just enough to show he meant no harm. He handed Ayanna a piece of cornbread. She hesitated again, but then accepted it. Nayeli, still wrapped like a small bird, took a piece as well, nibbling it with tiny bites. For a long time, the only sound was the crackling of the fire and the wind outside. It wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was the kind that let people breathe after too much fear. As the light began to fade, Thomas noticed how Ayanna's posture softened a little. Her guard was still up, but not like before. She looked at him and then at the small cabin, her eyes scanning the shelves, the tools, the boots by the door. She said something quietly to Nayeli in their language. The younger girl gave a sleepy nod. Thomas poured water into a small tin pot and set it on the fire. The scent of pine smoke filled the room. He wasn't sure why, but he felt something shifting inside him. For years, the cabin had been a quiet, lonely place where only his own footsteps echoed. Now there were two soft breaths beside the fire, two pairs of eyes watching him. It felt strange. It felt alive. Later that night, Thomas carefully moved a few things around, making a soft bed of blankets and furs closer to the warmest spot by the fire. Ayanna understood what he was doing and helped adjust Nayeli's blanket so she wouldn't shiver again. Thomas handed Ayanna a dry wool coat to layer on top of what she wore. She looked at it, surprised by his gesture. You keep, he said, patting his chest and then pointing to her. Warm. She touched the coat with her fingers like she wasn't sure if she was allowed to take it. Then slowly she wrapped it around herself. A soft sigh escaped her lips, the kind people make when warmth finally returns to cold bones. She whispered something to Nayeli that sounded like comfort. Thomas sat on his wooden chair near the window, his rifle leaning against the wall beside him. He didn't plan to sleep much that night. The storm wasn't over, and he didn't know if anyone else was out there looking for the sisters. But as he listened to the crackling of the fire and the soft breathing of the two girls, his usual unease faded a little. Hours passed. Nayeli fell into a deeper sleep, her face relaxed. Ayanna didn't sleep yet. She sat awake, hugging the coat tighter. Every now and then, her eyes flicked toward Thomas, still unsure if she could fully trust him. But she didn't look afraid anymore. She just seemed cautious, like a wolf deciding if the forest was safe again. Thomas leaned back in his chair. You're safe here, he said quietly, knowing she might not catch every word but hoping she'd hear the truth in his voice. The firelight flickered softly over their faces. Ayanna blinked slowly, then gave a tiny nod. She didn't speak, but in that small movement something changed between them. Outside, the wind screamed over the ridge. The snow covered everything in white silence. But inside that cabin, a fragile thread of trust was being woven, one warm fire at a time. Thomas stayed awake most of the night, listening to the storm, watching the two sisters sleep by the fire. He didn't know their story yet, and they didn't know his, but they were alive, and that was enough for now. He had found them in the snow, half frozen and fading, and now they were breathing safe, wrapped in warmth. He closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the fire's heat on his face. It was strange how quickly a quiet life could change. He had expected nothing from this winter morning. Yet by nightfall, two strangers had entered his world and filled the silence that had once felt endless. The storm outside kept roaring, but in the small cabin the night passed softly, like a promise that something new had begun. The storm finally ended 2 days later. The wind grew quiet and the sunlight slowly returned to the land like a shy visitor. The world outside the cabin had changed. Snow covered everything like a white ocean, smooth and untouched. The trees bent under the weight and the creek was frozen solid. The cabin looked small in that endless winter, but inside life had slowly warmed up. Thomas Hale pushed open the door early that morning, his boots crunching on the icy porch. He squinted at the bright light bouncing off the snow. The silence outside was deep. It was the kind of silence only a hard winter could create. He took a deep breath, the cold air burning his lungs, and then turned back inside where the fire still glowed warmly. Inside the cabin, Ayanna was already awake, sitting by the fire. Her long black hair was brushed back, and her hands were wrapped around the tin cup of warm tea Thomas had made for her earlier. Nayeli was still curled up under the blanket, breathing softly. She had grown stronger each day, but the cold had weakened her more than her sister. Ayanna looked over at her from time to time, as if making sure she wouldn't disappear. Thomas pulled off his gloves and sat down on the small wooden chair across from Ayanna. He noticed she watched everything carefully, the way he moved, the way he spoke, even how he poured the tea. She was a quiet woman, strong but cautious. "You feeling better?" he asked slowly, speaking softly. Ayanna tilted her head, catching some of the words, but not all. She placed a hand on her chest. "Better," she said in a soft voice. Then she gestured toward Nayeli, sleeping peacefully. "She better too." Thomas gave a small nod. "Good, very good." The room felt warmer than usual. It wasn't just the fire. Something in the air had changed since the night he found them. The cabin had always been quiet, but now there was movement. Soft footsteps, the crackle of the fire, and the sound of another heartbeat besides his own. Over the next few days, Ayanna and Nayeli slowly began to adjust to their new surroundings. They helped where they could, moving carefully as their strength returned. Ayanna would bring in small pieces of wood from the porch, while Nayeli sat near the fire sewing together strips of cloth Thomas had given her to repair their clothing. At first, the work was quiet, but little by little, a rhythm started to build between them. Thomas had always lived alone. He cooked for himself, fixed the fences, chopped the wood, and went to sleep without hearing another voice. Now when he walked into the cabin, he saw Ayanna stirring the fire and Nayeli humming softly under her breath. Still, it wasn't easy. Ayanna and Nayeli spoke little English. Thomas knew only a handful of Apache words from years on the frontier. This made conversations slow and sometimes confusing. There were moments when Ayanna would frown, trying to understand what Thomas meant, and Thomas would shake his head, struggling to explain. One afternoon, Thomas went outside to chop more firewood. The winter sun was pale and the air bit at his fingers. He swung the axe into the log, feeling the solid thud beneath his gloves. He worked steadily, one piece at a time. When he turned back toward the cabin, he noticed Ayanna standing near the porch, wrapped in his old wool coat. She was watching him closely, her eyes following each movement. He paused and gave a small wave. "Cold out here," he called. Ayanna stepped down carefully, boots crunching on the snow. She picked up one of the logs he had already chopped. Her arms were thin, but she held it steady. Thomas walked over quickly. "You don't need to." He started, then stopped when he saw the quiet determination on her face. She wanted to help, not to sit idle. "All right," he said softly. He handed her a smaller log. "This one." She nodded slowly, understanding at least part of it. She carried the wood back to the porch. For the first time in years, Thomas wasn't the only one working on this land. Inside, Nayeli smiled when she saw her sister bringing in the wood. She was sitting on a stool with a needle in hand, sewing small patterns into a piece of fabric. She didn't say much, but the way her eyes brightened told Thomas that having a warm cabin and someone to care for made her feel safe again. Still, there were quiet struggles every day. One evening, Thomas came back later than usual after checking the fence line. The sun had set and the forest was dark. When he pushed the door open, Ayanna stood near the fire with a worried look. She thought something had happened to him. She said something quickly in her language, her hands moving with sharp gestures. He didn't understand all of it, but he could hear the worry in her voice. "I'm okay," he said softly, setting his gloves down. "See? I'm fine." She crossed her arms, not fully convinced, and gave him a look that reminded him of the way his mother used to look when he came home late as a boy. Nayeli giggled quietly from her spot by the fire, hiding her smile behind her hands. It was the first sound of laughter he'd heard in this cabin in years. Another time, Thomas tried to offer them more food, but Ayanna shook her head and tried to give half of it back to him. She didn't want to take too much from the man who had saved them. But Thomas gently pushed the bowl back toward her. "Eat," he said firmly but kindly. "You need it." They looked at each other for a moment before she finally accepted. Slowly, trust began to grow like a fire catching on dry wood. Days turned into weeks. The snow outside stayed thick, but the cabin had changed completely. Ayanna learned a few more English words. Nayeli began to smile more. Sometimes Thomas would find her sitting by the window in the morning sun, humming soft songs in her language, her breath fogging the glass, but it wasn't all peace. Thomas knew the world outside the cabin could be hard. People in town didn't always look kindly on Apache people. If word spread that two young women were staying at his ranch, there could be questions. And there were dangers in the woods, too, wild animals and desperate travelers. One afternoon, Thomas rode to town for supplies. When he returned, he saw footprints in the snow outside the cabin. His heart tightened. He jumped off his horse and pushed open the door quickly. Ayanna was standing inside with his rifle in her hands. Her face was calm, but her eyes were sharp. She pointed to the footprints near the porch. Someone had come close. Thomas stepped outside again and looked around. The tracks were old, maybe a few hours. Whoever it was had walked near the cabin but hadn't knocked. That made him uneasy. On the frontier, a stranger that close could mean trouble. When he came back in, Ayanna still held the rifle, but not like someone afraid, like someone who had learned to protect what mattered. Thomas gently reached out and took the gun from her, nodding with quiet respect. "Good," he said. "Smart." She didn't understand every word, but she understood the tone. She gave a small nod back. That night, the cabin felt different. They kept the fire low and the lantern dim. Thomas sat in his chair, listening to the wind, thinking about the world outside. Ayanna and Nayeli sat near the fire, wrapped in blankets, their dark hair shining in the flickering light. In those quiet hours, Thomas realized something. At first, he thought saving them was a single act, a rescue in the snow. But it wasn't just that. They were part of his life now. They depended on him, and without meaning to, he had started to depend on them too. The loneliness he had lived with for years was fading, replaced with something heavier but warmer. Responsibility, connection, and something softer he didn't dare to name. Every day wasn't easy. The cold didn't disappear. The world outside was still uncertain, but inside that cabin something steady had grown between them. Trust didn't come with words. It came with small things, sharing bread, building fires together, watching the snow fall side by side. And even though Thomas didn't know what the future would bring, he knew this much. The cabin no longer felt like a place where only one man survived. It felt like a place where 3 souls lived, and for the first time in a long time he didn't feel alone. The snow had begun to soften as the sun grew warmer each day. Winter was not gone yet, but spring was slowly creeping in. The white blanket outside the cabin was melting in patches, revealing the dark brown earth beneath. The creek that had been frozen solid now sang softly again, the sound of water flowing through the land like a quiet promise. Inside the cabin, Thomas Hale's daily routine had changed without him even planning it. Where silence once filled the air, now there were small sounds of life. Ayanna moving around, sweeping the floor with a handmade broom. Nayeli softly singing to herself as she mended an old shirt. The fire still burned in the hearth, but now it felt different, warmer, not just from the flames, but from the people sitting near it. Thomas had learned a lot about the sisters in the past few weeks. He had picked up some of their words, just as they had learned more of his. Their English was still broken, but their eyes and hands spoke more than their mouths could. Ayanna had a quiet strength. She spoke with her eyes more than her voice. Nayeli was gentle, curious, and often smiled shyly when Thomas caught her watching him fix something around the ranch. The bond between them had grown slowly, like a small fire carefully fed. It wasn't forced. It came from small moments, warm meals shared at the table, quiet laughter when Thomas struggled to pronounce one of their Apache words, the way they left a piece of bread for him when he came home late from the fence line. One evening, the sun sank slowly behind the hills, painting the sky in soft gold. Thomas stood outside chopping wood, feeling the warmth of the day still lingering in the air. Ayanna came out to the porch, wrapped in a wool shawl, her hair loose over her shoulders. She watched him for a long time without saying anything. "You can come closer," Thomas called gently, setting the axe aside. Ayanna stepped down slowly, her boots sinking slightly into the damp snow. She stopped a few feet away from him, looking at the land around them. The snow was melting in places and tiny green shoots had begun to push through. "Spring," Thomas said, pointing at the plants. "Spring," she repeated softly, her accent giving the word a round, gentle shape. He smiled. "Yes, spring." For a moment they stood there without talking. The air was crisp and birds sang faintly in the distance. It was peaceful, the kind of moment that didn't need many words. Ayanna lifted her head slightly, breathing in the fresh air, her eyes calm. She turned to Thomas then and spoke in halting English. "When you find us, we almost—" She paused, struggling for the right word, then touched her chest and made a small motion downward, like something fading away. "Die," Thomas said softly, his voice steady. "You almost died." Ayanna nodded slowly. "Yes, cold, snow." Her hand trembled a little as she pointed toward the hills. "We walk many, many days." Thomas listened carefully. He didn't interrupt her. He just nodded, letting her know she could take her time. She continued, choosing each word like she was picking it from a river of memories. "Bad men come. We run. We hide. Snow come. We walk. No food. No fire. No horse." Her voice grew softer with each word. Thomas clenched his jaw slightly. He didn't need to hear more to understand. They had lost everything in that storm. The fact that they were even alive was nothing short of a miracle. Ayanna's eyes shifted to his face. "You help. You give warm. Give food. Save Nayeli. Save me." Thomas felt something heavy and quiet settle in his chest. "I just did what anyone should do," he said softly. She shook her head slowly. "Not anyone. Many see. No help. You help." Thomas didn't know what to say to that. He wasn't used to being thanked. He had lived most of his life expecting nothing and asking for nothing. But Ayanna's gaze was steady, and the gratitude in it was real. Nayeli came out of the cabin then, her small figure wrapped in a blanket. She looked at her sister and Thomas, her big dark eyes bright in the golden light. She walked over and stood beside her sister, slipping her hand into Ayanna's. She looked at Thomas and gave him the same shy smile she always gave him when she didn't have the words. That night, after they went back inside, something felt different between them. The sisters moved around the cabin like it was their home now, not a place they were borrowing. Ayanna stirred the stew on the fire without asking. Nayeli folded the blankets neatly near the bed. Thomas didn't have to say anything. It was quiet and easy, like they had all lived together for years. After dinner, the three of them sat near the fire. Ayanna sat on the floor, legs folded, while Nayeli leaned against her shoulder half asleep. Thomas sat in his old wooden chair. The firelight flickered softly on their faces, warming the room with a golden glow. Ayanna lifted her head and looked at him. There was no fear in her eyes anymore, only calmness. She spoke quietly. "In our way," she began, "when a man, save woman, save life." She hesitated, searching for words. "He is special." important. Family. Thomas straightened slightly in his chair, listening closely. In my people, she continued softly, a woman can choose. She chooses man who save, protect. It is our way. Her hand rested lightly on Nayeli's hair. We choose you. The words hung in the air, warm and heavy. Thomas didn't speak right away. He understood what she meant. He had heard stories of such traditions before. To them, what he did was not just kindness. It was something deeper. A bond. A promise. Nayeli opened her eyes slightly, sleepy but aware. She looked up at him with the same softness her sister had. There was no pressure in their eyes, no demand. Just trust. Ayanna had spoken for both of them. Thomas leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees. For years, he had built his life like a man living in a cave. He had accepted the silence, the loneliness, and the cold. He had never thought of belonging to anyone or anyone belonging to him, but here they were, two young women who had walked through death's door and found him on the other side. I didn't save you because I wanted something back, he said softly, his voice calm. I just couldn't leave you there. Ayanna gave a small nod. We know. That is why. Thomas looked at the fire, the flames twisting gently. He didn't know what the future would hold, but he knew one thing for sure. They trusted him in a way no one had in years. And he trusted them too, without even realizing when that happened. The days that followed felt softer than the cold winter weeks before. Thomas worked on the fence line, and the sisters helped with the chores. Ayanna carried wood and learned to use the broom. Nayeli learned how to milk the old cow, laughing when the animal tried to nudge her with its head. They shared meals at the same table. Sometimes, Ayanna told short stories in her language, her hands moving in the firelight. Thomas didn't understand the words, but he could feel the meaning in her voice. Nayeli often laughed softly, her eyes sparkling like someone who finally felt safe again. One afternoon, as Thomas fixed the roof of the small barn, he saw Ayanna leading Rusty, his horse, out into the sun. She stroked the horse's neck with a steady hand, speaking softly to him in Apache. Rusty stood calmly, as if he understood her. For a man who once lived with nothing but silence, seeing that sight filled something deep in Thomas's chest. It wasn't loud or sudden, it was quiet and steady, like the snow melting into the earth. They had gone from strangers on a winter night to something much more. Not just people sharing a cabin, but people sharing a life. Ayanna and Nayeli were not guests anymore. They belonged here, in their own way. And as the sun set behind the hills, Thomas stood on the porch watching the land around him glow with the soft light of a changing season. He could hear Nayeli laughing softly somewhere behind him and Ayanna humming a low tune as she worked. For the first time in years, the sound of home was more than the creak of wood and the crackle of fire. It was the sound of life, the sound of trust, the sound of something new being built in a place that was once only filled with silence. The snow melted slowly as the warm days grew longer, and the land around the cabin began to change. The white fields that once looked endless and cold were now soft and green. The creek sang louder each morning as it rushed over the rocks. Birds returned to the trees, filling the air with cheerful sounds. It was as if the land itself was waking up from a long, hard sleep. Thomas Hale stood on the porch with his hands resting on the railing. The sun touched his face gently. He could smell the wet earth and the wildflowers blooming along the edge of the woods. Spring had truly arrived. He took a slow breath and looked out at the horizon. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel the weight of silence pressing against him. Instead, he felt something warm in his chest, something steady, something like belonging. Behind him, inside the cabin, the sound of soft footsteps moved across the floor. Nayeli's light laugh filled the air as she tried to braid her long black hair with clumsy fingers. Ayanna followed behind her, shaking her head with a patient smile, stepping in to fix the braid properly. The two sisters moved around the cabin like they had always lived there. Their presence had filled every corner of the place with quiet life. Thomas stepped back inside, brushing his boots on the rug. Ayanna looked up from Nayeli's hair and smiled faintly. She no longer looked like the frightened woman he had found half buried in the snow. Her eyes were calm now, strong and warm. Nayeli's cheeks had color again, and her laugh had grown louder these past weeks. "Morning," Thomas said, his voice soft. "Morning," Ayanna answered slowly, her English much better now. Nayeli repeated the word too, giggling at how she said it. They shared breakfast together at the small wooden table. Thomas had built this table years ago with his own hands, back when he believed no one else would ever sit at it. Now, across from him sat two sisters who had survived the snow and changed everything without even meaning to. Ayanna poured the tea carefully, her hands steady. Nayeli broke pieces of cornbread and dipped them into the honey jar with childlike joy. As they ate, Thomas listened to their soft voices. Even when he didn't understand every word, he could feel the warmth in them. There was a time when his mornings had been silent, except for the crackle of the fire. Now, there was laughter, whispers, and the clinking of cups. After breakfast, they all went outside together. Ayanna carried a small basket and walked with quiet grace as if she was part of the land itself. Nayeli ran ahead, her hair flying behind her as she tried to catch the first butterflies of the season. Thomas followed slowly, his hat tilted back, watching them. They went down to the creek where the water was cool and clear. Nayeli dipped her feet in and let out a small laugh at the cold, splashing water toward her sister. Ayanna shook her head, pretending to scold her, but she couldn't hide the smile on her lips. Thomas sat on a rock nearby, listening to the sound of their laughter mixing with the water. It struck him then how much had changed. When he first found them, their faces had been pale, their bodies weak, their eyes filled with fear. Now they looked alive, glowing in the sunlight. Their voices filled the air with warmth. His cabin, once just a shelter, had become a home. But not everything outside that home was kind. One afternoon, Thomas rode into town for supplies. The shopkeeper raised an eyebrow when Thomas bought extra: flour, sugar, and cloth, more than a man living alone would need. A few men sitting on the porch outside watched him quietly, their eyes narrowing. One of them finally asked, "You got folks up there now, Hale?" Thomas didn't answer right away. He had expected this moment. He kept his voice calm. "I've got people I look after." "People?" another man asked, leaning back in his chair. "Or those Apache girls we heard about?" The words were sharp, but Thomas didn't let them bite. He loaded the supplies into his saddlebag and met their eyes. "They're under my care. That's all anyone needs to know." The men didn't say more, but their stares followed him as he rode away. He didn't care. His life was no longer about their opinions. When he returned to the cabin that evening, Ayanna was standing near the porch, waiting. She could always tell when something weighed on him. Her eyes asked the question without needing words. "Town talk," he said simply. "But it doesn't matter." Ayanna stepped closer, close enough for the warm wind to carry the soft scent of pine between them. She looked at him with quiet strength and said, "We are here, not there. Here." Her simple words carried more weight than a long speech ever could. Here. With him. In this place. That was what mattered. As the weeks passed, the small farm came alive again. Ayanna helped plant the seeds in the soft earth near the fence line. Nayeli brought water from the creek, splashing more on herself than on the plants, making both Thomas and Ayanna laugh. Rusty, the old horse, had grown used to their voices and followed Nayeli around like a gentle guardian. Every evening they sat near the fire. Sometimes they told stories, Thomas speaking slowly in English, Ayanna answering in her soft, accented words, Nayeli adding her own chatter with laughter. Sometimes they didn't speak at all. The quiet between them was warm, not cold like it had been before. One night as the stars filled the sky, Thomas sat on the porch alone. The sisters were inside, their laughter drifting softly through the open door. He looked out over the land and felt something deep and steady inside him. For years, his heart had felt like frozen ground, hard and empty. But now it felt like spring earth, warm, alive, ready to grow. Ayana stepped out onto the porch. She stood beside him, looking at the same sky. She didn't say anything at first. She didn't need to. "You changed this place," Thomas said quietly. Ayana tilted her head, not sure if she understood everything, but she caught enough. She placed her hand lightly on her chest. "We change," she corrected softly. "All of us." He looked at her then. Really looked. She wasn't just someone he had rescued from the snow. She was a woman who had walked through danger and chosen to live. She had brought warmth back to a place that had been cold for too long. Nayeli, too, had brought lightness, laughter, and small joys that he hadn't known he missed. The next day, as they all worked outside, something simple but meaningful happened. Nayeli ran up to him, holding a small wildflower she had picked from the edge of the field. She handed it to him with both hands, her eyes shining. "For you," she said slowly, her English careful but clear. Thomas took the flower gently, his rough fingers brushing hers. "Thank you," he whispered. She smiled so brightly that it felt like the whole world had opened up for a moment. As evening fell, they shared another meal together. Ayana sat across from him, her calm eyes steady. Nayeli leaned against her. "Sister," tired from a long day of playing and helping with the garden. Outside, the frogs sang by the creek and the wind rustled softly through the trees. Thomas realized something that night as the fire burned low. Life had not turned out the way he once imagined, but it had become something richer. He had found two souls on a frozen morning when he least expected it. He had taken them in, thinking it was a small act of kindness. But what grew from that moment was much bigger than he ever thought possible. They were no longer strangers. They were family, not by blood, but by trust, by shared days, by the simple warmth of choosing to stay together. The cabin wasn't just a cabin anymore. It was a home. The silence that had once lived there was gone, replaced by laughter, stories, the crackling of the fire, and the sound of three hearts beating under the same roof. As spring stretched into the long days of early summer, the land around them blossomed, and so did their lives. Thomas often found himself standing on that porch watching the sun rise over the fields, knowing deep down that everything had changed on the day he saw two figures freezing in the snow. He hadn't just saved them. They had saved him too, just in a different way. And in that quiet place on the frontier, far from the noise of towns and the whispers of others, a lonely rancher, an older sister with fierce eyes, and a younger sister with a shy laugh built a life together. A life that started in the snow and grew warm like the spring sun.